Ladies and gentlemen, everybody can hear me? So, I heartily want to welcome all of you to this event of Wilfried Martens Center, and I do it not only personally. My name is Werner Fasslabend. I'm the head of the Academic Council of Wilfried Martens Center, but I also want to do it in the name of the two directors that are present, Tommy Hutanen and Peter Hefele. Peter Hefele will be working as one of the speakers, and Tommy Hutanen will control everything from the first row. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to talk about a theme that I think is not only essential, but is absolutely underestimated in its importance for Europe and the globe. And therefore, I do not want to make many more words of welcome or whatever, but just I will try, okay, this will be better. I will try to splash into the Pacific or into the Indo-Pacific Ocean. I have prepared a few slides. I will present them, make it very short, and afterwards then I will hand over to Teresa Fellon, who will manage everything afterwards, the whole debate, and of course also all your questions that you could have. I immediately try to start. The first picture I want to show you is this picture of, well, one circle and two ellipses. And what you can see here is more or less the history of global importance, the shift of the global centers of gravity. In ancient times, the center of gravity used to be the Mediterranean area. Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Arabs, Ottomans, Turks, and so on. Then, after the discovery of America, it shifted to the Atlantic Ocean. And with the beginning of the 21st century, it is shifting to the Indo-Pacific area. Why? I will try to show it with the next slide, but before that, maybe just one short word for a definition. There are many definitions for the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific usually is seen as the Indian Ocean and the western part of the Pacific Ocean, the whole region around the Asian continent and reaching to the very east of Africa, and of course also going down to Australia. Yeah, what is the reason? The reason is very simple. This is just a comparison of the population in the different regions. I make it very short. I mean, there is some increase in America. There is not only stagnation, but a decrease of population in Europe, in Russia, and in Eastern Asia, not only in China, but also in Japan. And there is quite some increase, a huge increase, especially in Africa, in Western Asia, in Southern Asia, and in Southeastern Asia. And this is the reason that, of course, the dynamics are changing completely. Next picture. You can see this at the economic side when you take a look at the so-called BRICS and the next 11. The next 11s are those countries that are supposed to more or less overtake similar positions in the future as the next 11s. And you can see that except Mexico, Brazil, and Nigeria, practically all of them are within the reach of the Indo-Pacific Ocean or Indo-Pacific region. If we go further on, we just take a look, in order to see, have just a glimpse at this region of dynamics this is the yellow countries. And they probably will define more than any others the future dynamics on the globe. Let me go further on. Of course, within the regions, also in Asia and in Africa, there are quite some differences. This is just a short picture about the workforce, because certainly economic development will depend on the one hand, not only on the population as such, but also especially on the middle class population and of course on the potential of workforce. And you can see that here especially South Asia will have a specific important function. Let me go further on. The region is not only important for workforce, but also for resources. And maybe you can see just out of this picture, you know, in 9 out of 14 of the most important products or resources for future products, China is the biggest producer, is producing more than 50% of the global production. This is the maritime lifeline. When I drew this map for the first time, I called it Maritime Lifelines for East Asia. In the meantime, I don't do anymore as such, because this has also become the lifeline for Europe. Because this is the line where most of our products will be shifted or will be transported into the world. You have to be aware that this is not only for Europe, but for most parts of the world. Yeah, of course, this region is also important for climate change. At the moment, it's around about between 57 and 60% of all the carbon emissions are coming from these regions. In the year 2000, it was only 37%. And insofar you can see, I mean, this increase of importance, how fast this is going. Yeah, this is also the fact for the future global energy consumption. And this picture just shows, you know, how the demand probably will develop until 2040. The big increase will be over there. Yeah, coming to one of the decisive functions. This is just a list of the top 10 patents in 2019. And you can see number 1, number 2, number 3 is coming out of the region, which means China or South Korea. So far, it's not American companies, it's not European companies that are at the top, but it's a competition that certainly has become very relevant for our continent. Yeah, and at the end, I also have to say, it's not only a question of economy and politics, it also is a question of security and military affairs. We have this arc of crisis in East Asia with North Korea, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. And this is not only an arc of crisis, it is also, and this should be the last picture, it is also the space where the global power confrontation is happening. This is the picture, as you can see, confrontation between China and America mainly, but you also have the economic number 3 in Japan, very close also the military number 2 and number 3 with Russia, and you have South Korea and North Korea. And so far you can imagine that this hotspot certainly has become number 1 hotspot of the world. This is my introduction in order just not to go into a specific question, but to show if we don't occupy ourselves with these regions, we will be outsiders. The region will have its development. This is inevitable. For us, it will be decisive whether we occupy ourselves, we take it as it is, and try to influence this development. This is the big task also for this moment. And with these words, I want to hand over to Teresa Fellon. Please, Teresa, go on.
Opening remarks, but I think we should just dive right in with the experts. You did a really wonderful job of showing how important the Indo-Pacific is to Europe in terms of connectivity, freedom of sea lanes of communication, and also for future of Europe's prosperity. So I want to thank the Martin Center for organizing this. This is really a timely issue, especially now we're kind of looking ahead. How can we tweak the Indo-Pacific strategy? As we know, the EU passed it in a year, which in EU terms is very fast. Germany, the Netherlands, and France also have their own Indo-Pacific strategies. So this shows that there's a real interest in the region and focused attention. So I will start off. All of you have access to this biography, and I go to so many conferences. I want all of you to have time to ask your questions. That's why you came here. You're not zooming in. So I'm going to just keep it brief and let the speakers do the talking. Our first speaker is Alfred Gerstel, and he is a senior advisor, Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. So glad that you could join us today. How can the EU reconcile limited resources, especially in the military area, while trying to play a significant role in the region? Because of its limits, does the EU risk becoming a paper tiger in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, thank you very much, Teresa, for asking me the question. But first of all, really thank you very much to the Martin Center for inviting me. Very happy to be here with you. Well, you're completely right. The military resources of the EU are very limited. However, if we look at the economic resources and also the diplomatic resources of the EU, well, they're quite plentiful. Also, even more now directed to the Indo-Pacific region, because it's, as Dr. Faserabend pointed out, it's becoming a lifeline for Europe. So from the perspective of the Indo-Pacific powers, I would say the EU is definitely an economic power. It's also a normative power, but weaker than in Europe, or probably other parts of the world. Happy to explain it in a little bit later. The EU is definitely not a security provider for any Indo-Pacific nation, but to turn it positively, the EU is not a security threat to any other power. So at least that's very positive. For the EU, and you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategies, one of the key aims is, of course, promoting the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And for this, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is one of the key driving forces. And accordingly, the EU also emphasizes its cooperation with ASEAN. Also crucial, and thanks that we have seen the charts, because Indo-Pacific is a huge region, and we should never forget it's a maritime region. So also, at least 1/3 of the global trade passes through the South China Sea, also the European trade. So to promote freedom of navigation, to secure maritime security is definitely a key interest. But here we do see some of the obstacles for the EU, because the EU has no joint navy. So the EU needs to rely on the member states. And of course, in particular, France. There's some German participation, but of course it's not that prominent. Netherlands, other countries may join. But after Brexit, it's in fact only France that has, from the EU side, notable power projection capabilities. And this, of course, limits the EU's influence. Otherwise, but I think that also illustrates the approach of the EU. I would label it a Team Europe approach. So it's a combination of EU as supranational institutions and closely cooperating with the member states. But this makes it more and more important that there is coordination within the EU, between the member states, the EU. So this is certainly a task that I think that could be done even better in the future. otherwise, the EU approach is also really a strong emphasis on cooperation with ASEAN, with like-minded partners as well. And here I do also see a risk because to maintain the rules-based order in Indo-Pacific, we need strong multilateral institutions. We really need a strong and credible ASEAN. And we do currently have two countervailing trends. First of all, it's the Sino-US competition, which really asks any regional country, but also non-regional countries or actors like the EU to find its role in between. And that's not easy. And the other trend that we see, which is of course also a response to this competition, is by and increasing unilateral cooperation. So just to mention AUKUS, a very recent security alliance, which I think is very interesting to watch how it develops. And of course also the quadrilateral security dialogue with the format Quad Plus. So here there are some opportunities for like-minded countries or also countries with similar interests, just to mention Vietnam, but probably also the EU to cooperate with the US, with Australia, Japan, and India.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your opening remarks. I appreciate that. Markus Schürmann is the Chief Executive Officer and Delegate German Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Japan. He just flew in from Tokyo, so he's been very busy, so we're delighted that he made the trip all the way here. The developments in China offer all European companies the opportunity to rethink their Asia strategy. The main issues here are diversification, relocation, and which countries should be given greater focus and why. The developments also offer the opportunity to focus more on like-minded countries. What can be learned here, especially for economic security in Japan? This is a big issue that Europeans are wrestling with, so we look forward to your insights from the region.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and good afternoon. I'm still in the middle of the jet lag. I hope I do not fall asleep and manage to make my remarks properly. Once again, thank you very much for attending and giving me the chance to join. Yeah, it's really a very important time we are facing, and we are seeing this development actually evolving since 2011. So you wonder why 2011? I think 2011 was a very, very decisive year for Japan. 2011 was a year of Fukushima. And this was the first time that we ever have been talking about supply chains, even without knowing what this actually is. So we learned for the first time dependency on supply chains. The Japanese have asked themselves, what do we have to do? How do we have to duplicate? How do we create a better and more stable supply of goods? Do we duplicate supply chains? Do we duplicate production in Japan, or do we even expand overseas? And the answer was, since then, Japan has started to focus on even more overseas foreign direct investment. This can be nicely seen in OECD data, and depending on the year you are looking at, the FDI from Japan is more than the combined Chinese and Korean FDI, depending on the year looking at. So it's really, really a substantial commitment that Japan does when expanding to overseas. So that's point number one. This means this gives us, of course, also an opportunity to start more cooperation with Japanese partners outside Japan, not only focusing on Japan. So that's a so-called third country business. And here, Japan is also looking for partners and European partners, and I can tell now from the context which I have, of course, in the German business community, there have been in the last 4 years 36 joint projects between German and Japanese partners doing these third country projects outside. So I think it's a substantial number, and it underlines that a cooperation in this regard is really possible. And this, of course, helps to make business also a little bit more independent from businesses in China. As you know, German business is very closely affiliated, closely connected with this big trading country, Japan, as well. But the question is now, of course, taking the current circumstances into consideration, how can we mitigate risks? That's a key issue, and the key answer is, of course, diversification. What does this mean? Where do we diversify? Are we looking for other countries? What can we learn from the Japanese? And the Japanese are to a far higher degree connected in China than, for example, the German industry. So there are 15,000 Japanese companies invested in China, 3 times more than German companies there. And as you know, Japan also by their Japanese are always risk averse, and so they try to mitigate risk. They are always very sensible in this regard, and as a result, looking at all the developments going on, of course they said, okay, what can we do? How can we promote? How can we support our own Japanese business in Japan, our Japanese business to mitigate the risk? Do we offer additional funds returning businesses to Japan? Do we support companies going to other countries? And there is a lot going on, and I would not like to go into too many details because I believe there will be more questions coming up afterwards. But one of the key terms in these days is, of course, economic security. This is a part of the whole development. Japan, as you may know, has started a political process 2018, 2019. It all went through parliament. Now Japan has its own minister and have started the Economic Security Promotion Act with 4 pillars, I should say, focusing on infrastructure, patent, and also security issues. And all this is now a kind of very comprehensive, holistic approach to try making the best out of the current situation by continuing cooperation with all the existing partners, but trying to build a new base and then try to direct this into a future direction. I would leave it at this point with this, and I believe for further discussions we will go into more details, I believe.
And that will really launch a lot of discussion, I'm sure, especially the best practices in Japan's exposure to China. And now we have our own Peter Heffele, the policy director at the Martin Center. The big issue now, especially in Brussels, is green transition. So how can Europe work with their Indo-Pacific partners on the green transition?
Teresa and also Werner, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Indeed, I had many years of experience in Asia dealing with the sustainable or green transformation, but also the discussion, of course, we have here in Brussels. For me, it's a kind of third dimension which cross-cuts a bit both into the sphere of politics and economics. And I think that transformation policy will be a really shaping factor in the future of EU, not only domestic relations, but also foreign relations. And we should not take it wrong, even with we are not now occupied with the war in Ukraine and the return of realpolitik, this topic of green transition will not go away. It will be an essential dimension of our own domestic and foreign policy. And Dr. Gasly mentioned that concept of normative power. This is something where Europe is very ambitious. It sets its agenda, and it differentiates, I think, very much from the approaches China or US, for example, have towards that region. None of these powers have similar ambition in this respect, and this is, by the way, widely understood in Asia-Pacific, and that makes us very much attractive as well. Yet, on the other side, our understanding of transformation is sometimes a bit narrow. It comes from our own history of the environmental and the climate change discussion, but I think Asia has a much broader approach, and I think the events in the Ukraine, for example, put us to the point that we have a more comprehensive, inclusive understanding, and now issues of security. Mr. Schumann, you mentioned that issue in the Japan discussion, also of innovation and social justice are now part of this discussion, and this widens the opportunities for cooperating with nations in Asia. The quote that the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy should be in Europe, better jobs, better social cohesion, that is the quote not from 2023, but from roughly 2000. And some of you might remember this is the Lisbon process. This was this huge, ambitious goal. Well, it is valid today, and I think this broader understanding is much better suited for cooperation in Asia, widening this very narrow approach of the environmental and climate change issues. You all know that currently we have a very fierce debate on state regulations. There's a huge political fight in the parliament how to regulate, how to transform the discussions on the ESG issues, for example. This standards taxonomy goes very much into the heart how these transformations should be made more through market processes or by micromanaging decisions, for example, even on the environment, on the level of enterprises. I think this is an issue where we can learn a lot from Asia, and we have to be way more open to experiences and chances from the Asia-Pacific region. And for me, that is the only way to a fruitful exchange, keeping open, not preaching them how to approach, how to manage. The diversity in Asia is really mind-blowing. Yes, and you both mentioned the issue, the future of globalization, which is, for the moment, I think, quite open. And there's one concept, I think, which is very common for both, and this is a point where interests can converge. That's reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing, of course, the resilience of our societies and economic systems. This could be, in my opinion, a unifying moment for Asia and Europe, and that does not necessarily mean further fragmentation. That would be the worst outcome of this, and in this respect, I think we should avoid also building up walls of green protectionism, for example. This danger is still looming around EU foreign policy, EU trade policy, but this would be the worst outcome because keep open, Asia is a fascinating region. We can learn a lot of things, and the dynamics in that region hopefully will also come back to Europe. Thank you.
Peter, I'll just follow up with you right away then with a question. Today, one of the top stories in the Financial Times was European business people complaining that Europe is becoming less and less, it's an eroding area for investment. It's getting harder and harder to do investments here because it's not so clear. There's a lot of red tape coming from Brussels. How would you answer that? Especially we see the debate within Europe about kind of diesel engines versus electrical. How will this be perceived in the Indo-Pacific if Europe doesn't keep the promises that they made in the past?
Well, indeed, it has to stay and keep its promises. Otherwise, we would be a disappointment, and they have already adopted. I think there's a lot of interest, and so Shubin, you mentioned this cooperation project. This is not only happening in the region, this is also true for Europe as well. We, yes, facing a dramatic situation with these pressures on the energy prices, for example, but we have to keep the way ahead in the direction. Otherwise, we lose our competitive advantage. This will be hard, crucial years ahead of us, I'm quite convinced, but Asia has invested in a partner, I think, which made a step ahead and can show a kind of future we have not seen elsewhere, and Europe has this advantage, absolutely.
I'm going to go to Marcus now, just because we're on the economic aspect. There was a lot of discussion about FTAs, free trade agreements with countries in the region. Japan has a free trade agreement with the EU, excuse me. So what are the prospects in the region for further? I know they've restarted talks with Thailand. How do you see this? Because Europe is trying to be a normative power, these free trade agreements, do you see them, how is this fleshing out?
So my understanding is that for Japan, this has to do a lot with multilateralism, maintaining peace and freedom and the basic values we share. I think that's one of the key reasons for Japan, and also looking to RCEP, so which is the other key FTA which went into force recently. I mean, that's a free trade agreement that brings China, Japan and Korea for the first time ever together. And this has not been the case before, and I think in this regard, Japan will not only enjoy and pick the fruits as a result of this RCEP, but it is, I think, also a very strong political signal to maintain and fight for peace and freedom and multilateral trade based on standards and rules, etc. And I think that's one of the keys why Japan is so much behind that. And that's also one of the reasons, looking back to the last couple of years when under the Trump government and Trump regime, if I may say like that, when Trump decided basically to leave all the other initiative, CPTPP, etc. So the US basically stepped out of all these free trade agreements, and Japan, it was then Prime Minister Abe who said, no, let's try to keep it alive, to fight for the better and multilateralism, and fight for the global trade. And this, I think, was one of the key points that brought Japan very much back to the front lines of our global trade. You may remember when Japan for many years is part of the G7 group. Look at the family photos which are usually taken at the end of the meetings. Japan was not really very prominently taking part, kind of. Now they are always in the center of the photo, and this, I think, shows that over the years Japan has got a lot of more influence on a global scale. Japan is very much back, and very much back also on the agenda, not only in politics but also at companies. And that's the reason why right now there's so much focus now on Japan, looking on alternatives, because there are some other neighbors that encourage looking and painting a little bit of a new picture.
No, it's an excellent point, and we know that Prime Minister Kishida is on his way to Kiev.
Yes.
So
Yes.
see, and they're hosting the G7. So Japan is really, trying to be more proactive, especially in Europe. I know that they have been coming to Europe to give a lot of briefings as well in the past. So this is they've been quite proactive. Alfred, to follow up with you, it's not just Europe that has demographic issues. Many countries in Asia also face this, and the future seems to be drone technology and unmanned systems, underwater unmanned systems. Do you see possible cooperation in this region with Asia for PESCO funds or Horizon funds? Europe is talking about possibilities of defense cooperation. How do you see this playing out in the future?
Yeah, well, in general, so I do not want to diminish the role of the EU as partner in defense security matters, but the focus is very much on non-traditional security. Also, the EU is working within ASEAN, in the ASEAN Regional Forum. There's a lot of training, capacity building going on. So, in fact, the criticism that I would make, the impact or the contributions of the EU, they are not very visible, or not very visible for ordinary citizens, neither in Europe nor in the region. So I think here the EU can certainly do better. In regard to defense security cooperation, yes, the EU or European nations are really sought after partners because of their high technology, their high standards, their high credibility. And also something we should not forget, Russia is in the Indo-Pacific and especially in Southeast Asia. Okay. Yes. Okay. I hope it's better now. Yeah. So back to Russia. We see Russia has been in the last 10, 15 years the main weapons provider for Southeast Asia. But last year, Russians' exports in arms to Southeast Asia dropped to less than $90 million. So there's definitely, everyone is watching what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. Of course, Russian weapons, they're not as good as many people believed. So. And of course, Russia don't have much space to export the weapons, unfortunately need them themselves. So here there's definitely more space for European countries to fill the void. But we also have to be careful because there is, of course, also the observation that there's already an arms race going on in Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific. So we should not, as Europeans, we should not make such a big splash to steer the arms race further. I think there could be more meaningful contributions as well. But of course, security defense cooperation, that is definitely a way for the Europeans to make bigger waves, but hopefully in a positive sense.
I love how you picked up on the making a splash. I thought that was very... the Indo-Pacific is so huge, we do need to make a splash in that region. But I'd like to just do a follow-up. I mean, we have variable geometries, different types of cooperation among EU member states, and you mentioned in your opening remarks about how Germany even sent a frigate the first time in 20 years. They sent a frigate called the Bayern to the region. And I think in some respects, even though it seems small, like a splash, it's important because then these countries experience for themselves the tensions possibly in the region, we know that the Bayern was harassed
Yeah.
by
The
certain
Chinese,
yes
yeah.
in the region. So it doesn't matter maybe if people write reports and if they experience it themselves, they have a very different viewpoint. So how do you envision future EU cooperation? I know it's small scale, and I know you said don't have, but do you see more variable geometry, or do you see more EU level?
I think it will remain really the mixture between EU, a joint approach, and when it comes to specific actions like maybe conducting a freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, then it can only be led by France, and probably with some German Navy officials on board. But I think it would be a national one, and maybe there is also an EU flag, but it's probably more a national one.
I see two fingers from Peter.
Just to add a bit, I think there are a lot of initiatives already going on. Australia is one of the major partners in military industry. On the level of the general staff training, there's a long-established relation between Singapore, for example, and the German Bundeswehr. The last visit of Mr. Scholz clearly marked in Japan, that there's a huge cooperation now, and East Asia, that means Northeast Asia, South Korea, for example, and Japan are massively providing military goods to the Ukraine. So this is a new dimension, and we might indeed see how the European instruments might evolve, might it be PESCO, other new forms, how they will tap into this issue. So it's not the presence on the ground, but a lot of other fields of integration, also in intelligence, for example. This is a long-established issue.
And as we know, the EU has established Primario, so this kind of domain awareness that everyone needs to know what's going on in their own waters. So this is a global good that Europe is providing, and I think that's a very positive development that doesn't really get enough attention as it should. Please.
It's really important to mention the EU as normative power. But to give you an example, I was working at a Czech university, and there we conducted surveys in about 16 countries, representative ones, and we also asked about the image of China, the US, and Europe. And for instance, concerning the image of the EU as a normative power, which means contributing to the rules-based order, very positive in the Indo-Pacific, but not as positive as the US image. So I think one of my interpretations is, yes, both contribute to multilateralism, the EU, I would say more, but the EU lacks the hard power to defend this order. And again, I would use the South China Sea as an example, because it's important to endorse the award of 2016 of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, so in favor of the Philippines against the 9-dash line of China, but it's the US, the country that conducts the freedom of navigation operations. It's not the EU. So I think you really need also hard power to back up the normative or the soft power.
Yes,
I
Peter.
also may add, it's an issue of communication. I have seen a lot of initiatives, and the money Europe spends in that region is, next to Japan, tremendous, but it is not coordinated. A lot of initiatives by single countries, the EU as well, differently effective, I would say, on the ground, but this is a big issue. We see this in the Western Balkans, but we see it even more in East and Southeast Asia. But this is an issue where we have to improve our performance massively.
All right, well, that's frank. So the current approach of the EU in the Indo-Pacific, you would say, is rather inadequate.
It could be much better given the resources we have at hand, the concepts. Yes, and I fully agree that this issue of normative power still matters. It seems the kind of soft power, but we should not underestimate. That is interesting things which we can build upon. Making use of it is another issue.
Very good. You mentioned earlier about China's 15,000 companies. I'm sorry, Japan's 15,000 companies in China, that they're very interested in de-risking. In Europe, we have the vocabulary of de-risking rather than decoupling. What are some of the takeaways you've seen from Japan's experience?
So what we are observing is actually that Japan, of course, is always much more hesitating, much more risk averse than, for example, our German companies. This is what I've mentioned before. You know, one very prime example we always have, referring to Volkswagen, for example, relying up to 40% on the business related with China. If you look for a Japanese company that is comparable to Volkswagen, then of course you look to Toyota, for example. That's another prime example. And Toyota's business is depending on China 18 to 20%, let's say half of that of Volkswagen. So this is already a very clear signal. What is very interesting to see is that Japan continues to invest in China. There is no decoupling from China, not at all. Japan depends and relates and interacts with China, of course. But they are even more risk averse. They are even more sensitive in realigning their supply chains, looking for new suppliers. So the dependency on only one supplier, so this time is completely over, and Japan has always looked for more suppliers, and now looking to Europe and bringing Europe into play, Japan is looking and reaching out for other, in this case now European suppliers, to get more independent from, for example, the partners in China, for example. And this is an opportunity for our business, of course. And what is also quite interesting to see is that while on the one hand side, Japan is providing a lot of financial funds and is trying to make investment into Japan more attractive. So asking or promoting Japanese business to return to Japan, we do not see any real significant action. So from time to time, you see that the one or other Japanese company is going back to Japan, and when, of course, the story is getting more attractive, and then it's getting into the press when it comes to Halbleiter, when it comes to the field of semiconductor. Of course, that's a huge issue where Japan is tying up either with American partners, but is also trying to upgrade its own resources in Japan. Of course, and then we can say Japan has a very strategic interest in that regard. And it is quite interesting to know that, for example, wages are, when it comes to production, trying to promote reinvesting into Japan in terms of setting up production facilities. It's quite interesting to see that wages in Japan are 25 to 30% below German wages. So that's quite interesting. Hardly anybody really knows. And of course, you have the high robot density and the loyalty of the Japanese workforce. I mean, that's well known. And so these factors make it quite interesting to invest in Japan. And when it comes to high tech, Japan is providing funds in billions, and these funds are available to foreign partners, to foreign companies as well. So it's not a Japanese story, so to speak. So it's really open to foreign investors as well, and I think that's important to mention.
Alfred, the EU is getting closer to Taiwan and intensifying its cooperation. There's a dialogue on disinformation with Taiwan. In the past, it has always been kind of below, under the waterline, but we see more MEPs visiting Taiwan, more leaders from Czech Republic, for example, picking up the phone and giving Taiwan a call. So where does Taiwan fit into the Indo-Pacific strategy? It's not mentioned. China's mentioned. That Europeans can do business with China. They can cooperate on mutual interests on a case-by-case basis. How do you envision this? Because we also know recently that Taiwan has wanted to invest in a chip-making facility, perhaps in Germany, but they feel they're not getting enough support from Europe, so they have kind of put that on ice temporarily, hopefully. So how do you see this play out?
Yeah. Well, the Indo-Pacific strategy is really fascinating because it's, in fact, very positive about China, because it's in the context of we are offering inclusive cooperation, and this also includes China, which of course means you have to read the Indo-Pacific strategy here, and on the other side, the China strategy of the EU, which is of course much more critical to get the full picture. Taiwan, it's really fascinating, and thanks for mentioning the Czech Republic, because it's really interesting to see that it's mostly the small Eastern European countries. So I would also like to add Slovakia, Lithuania, Poland. They're kind of driving forces for closer relations of the EU with Taiwan. And here we have mentioned also, Peter, you mentioned it, like-minded countries or democratic countries, and Taiwan plays it very well. I think similar to Japan right now, both emphasize, we like the Europeans, we endorse democracy, human rights, so we share the same values. So this is the reason why you as EU should cooperate with us as Taiwan closer. And I'm really curious how this will play out, because yes, we have the one China policy, and China has, of course, some legitimate interests and also legitimate reasons to criticize the EU policies if they become too close to Taiwan. So I'm curious how it will outplay. But I do expect close economic relations between EU and also the individual member states and Taiwan. Security, defense also, but this is, of course, very, very sensitive. Yeah.
I want you to all start thinking about your questions. We're going to open up the floor very soon to questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, just add one additional remark while touching upon Taiwan. I think when we are looking into this direction, and I think we always have to make clear, now coming once again from a more Japanese perspective, and I liked actually one of the pictures, one of the slides which have been shown in the beginning. You have nicely shown Japan is kind of squeezed in between the US and China. This was a very nice slide actually, and but that's actually the question what we are here talking about to some extent. And in this regard, I just wanted to add. We also have to look what is the role of Korea in between. That's I think one aspect we didn't touch upon yet. And as you may know, just last week the Korean Prime Minister was in Japan after I think 11 or 12 years for the very first time, and he has taken unprecedented steps to. Well, he was quite pragmatic, I think, in approaching and solving all the old historic war issues to some extent, and what we know and what can be read, of course, in media. So he's not really supported by the Korean population. But in Japan, this has been actually very positively received. And of course, I don't feel able to comment on the economic impact on that. But I think what is definitely one aspect in these days is what you have mentioned, that closer Japan-Korea cooperation will, of course, help to support peace and also counterweight the one or other developments in Asia. And I think we have two medium-sized nations there. Of course, Japan is economically stronger than Korea naturally. But I think if both countries tie up their economic power, I think this could help make the one or other difference depending on the topic we are, of course, or technologies we are looking at. I think this is a very, very positive development in my opinion.
It's an incredible development, and even though you mentioned he's brave enough to make this kind of overture to Japan, even though the public is not really supporting him, and after an impasse of over 11 years, he went to Tokyo. Yes. So now everyone's waiting to see Japan's response. But I was at a side event. I spoke at a side event at the Munich Security Conference, and Munich at that time is just bursting at the seams, full of people from all over the world, and you can't help but meet some people that you know. And I met someone from the Chinese delegation, and we had a long meeting for an hour. And the thing he was most concerned about was this Japan-South Korea rapprochement, and that they were deeply concerned that because this leader will be in power for 5 years, and that this will really have a big effect on the region. And I'm glad that you pointed this out about South Korea, because it's very important that we discuss them as well. Japan and South Korea are very advanced in their digital transformation. Perhaps this is an area that could be beneficial for the EU to cooperate. How do you, I know your green transformation was your area of expertise, but do you see possible cooperation in digital transformation?
Well, when we talked about this normative issue, the digital worlds and the regulatory framework is of utmost importance, and you, in this respect, has good opportunities to set also standards. If you look into the data security issue, the discussion in Japan, and the rules are not so different. So there's a platform of cooperation, not only on the technological level, but on the normative, on the regulatory side. This is an unexploited field of cooperation, and we can join into South Korea and Taiwan. And if I may add to the Taiwan issue, again, there's a lot of other unexploited opportunities with Taiwan. We are so focusing now on the military security aspect, but beyond that chip issue, there is a lot of issues in renewable energies. Taiwan is very active in Southeast Asia. This is often forgotten. It's not only Japan and South Korea who pour a lot of money in recent years, but Taiwan under the water level has been one of the major contributors to the development in Southeast Asia. And this is something in terms of a triangular cooperation, for example, Europe should use. We have had been too restrictive and restraining ourselves in terms of cooperation with Taiwan. I'm quite sure.
Maybe you can comment about, now we know there's a free trade agreement with Japan and South Korea. There was some talk about possibly having one with Taiwan, but we saw Gunnar Regan recently say, we don't need that, we have good trade relations with Taiwan. How do you see the future of that playing out?
That goes to another topic. I think, Mr. Schumann, you mentioned the free trade issue. My personal opinion, frankly speaking, that the way we have approached this issue from part of the EU has been not very helpful. We have come to an end with this. We have overloaded. We put too much on that instrument. My recommendation is quite clear that we should rather go back to traditional trade cooperations and trade agreements and then add step by step the other issues, be it the environmental issue, the social issues. I think we have loaded much on the shoulders of the trade policy, because quite understandably, that's an issue where the EU has the almost exclusive right. It has not many other instruments where they can decide by their own. But I think we have come to a dead end in this respect. We will not see any further free trade agreements the way we had it with Japan, South Korea, or Australia. I don't think that Vietnam will agree very much on further burdens and regulatory issues set by the EU on one side.
And you heard it here first. Peter is very frank, and I really appreciate that, because this is a city where people kind of hem around the corners, and I would suggest that you read his papers online, which are available at the Martens website. Now I would like to open up the floor to your questions. Please identify yourself, keep it sharp and short, and make sure it's a question, okay? Thanks.
Yeah, hi. Yes, my name is Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, a new dialogue network. Just for Alfred, I would just say, first of all, don't rule out the UK playing a role here. The new UK-France declaration has something in there about combined maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific. It's time, let's move past Brexit. Let's just start to work with UK better on security and defence. Second, NATO and EU. I mean, NATO's hard power can surely support the EU's normative power. Isn't it time we saw them as a combined capability now, considering how many members are the same? And just on China, I mean, I hear the drumbeat to confrontation all the time. I just wondered what the alternative vision is there for a more cooperative relationship with China, without being naive about it. But I just wondered if there is an image. Sometimes it seems like we want to punish China for doing better than us at technology and getting ahead on certain things. So am I being too naive, or is there a vision where we could be working better?
I'm going to collect 2 more questions. Okay. Yes?
Thanks very much. Tony Gilland from MCC Brussels, another new think tank on the block. Thanks for the comments. I think the points that Peter just made about regulation and free trade agreements are really important and worth further discussion. But I would like to ask about soft power, particularly in relation to China, because Thomas Farsi, I don't know if you read his latest column in Unheard, very, very interesting comments, and I've heard it elsewhere also at Carnegie Europe just the other evening, that actually President Xi is playing quite a clever game. And in relation to Saudi Arabia and Iran, putting forward China as a helpful peace broker, even with his visit to Putin, he's playing to the global south. And in Farsi's assessment, actually it's the West that's beginning to look isolated. You mentioned the rules-based order, Alfred, and many people, particularly China, and not only China, and many people in the global south would see it as outdated and skewed towards the interests of one country in particular. So if we're going to talk about soft power, we're going to talk about rules-based order, if we look at the reality of what's unfolding before our eyes, without needing to start talking about a major conflict, but just the influence that the different dynamics, how does Europe engage with that? And I think Peter's onto something, but it's a very, very small part of the picture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tony. And one more question? Okay, yes, please. Oh.
Thank you. Robert Stell, formerly NATO, now Pulaski Foundation. It's a comment in a form of question because I hope, there'll be a reaction. I mean, lots of interesting insights, thank you for them. But one overriding feeling I get is that, I mean, there is, and it came out in a lot of different presentations. I mean, the key for me was almost the opening slides. You know, I mean, there's a confrontation, but it's between China, Russia, and US. I mean, there is a confrontation, and the choices made by Europe, particularly when we talk about hard security, but not only, it has many dimensions, will define, European defense, European resilience, and the trends today are not that good. I mean, Europe is becoming more dependent on China when it comes to research and development, key industries. So the point I'm trying to make and seeking your reaction is, aren't you actually sort of not addressing the main issue, which is frankly out, still, in spite of all the policies, Europe somehow sitting on a fence, and as an aside remark to Mr. Gressel, I mean, it's always interesting as a Pole to hear that Poland is a small country in CE, but fair enough. We always learn something. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, that's a very rich discussion right there. So Alfred, I'll start with you because some of the questions were directed at you.
I'll try to start really, thanks for the question. I'll try to combine two of your question comments in one. Let me start with the big picture. Yes, the rules-based order, it is mostly a Western order. It's a US-led order, also in the Indo-Pacific. However, ASEAN, so that's a regional organization, of course has a strong impact, and there are ASEAN way norms influenced as well. So I think it's a mixture. But yes, of course, China is competing this order, but we also have to emphasize that so far China benefited from the Western order, also in economics. So just think of the WTO, since it became member, I think the growth has really skyrocketed. So far it was beneficial, but this also what was the big change. Now China has the military power, the hard power, to in fact contest the US leadership. And this makes the Indo-Pacific region so volatile because all other actors have to respond. And many of them choose a so-called hedging strategy, which means good relations with China and the US. And I think this hedging approach is also very beneficial for the EU because the EU, as we have learned today, can offer in economics, in trade, also normative level, also in security and defense, the Europeans can offer the Indo-Pacific nations something, so they become more involved in the regional order. NATO, yes, on the one hand side, I think it's logical, and NATO has not yet developed an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think 2 or 3 years ago, there were kind of first guidelines, so I would expect that there will be a kind of Indo-Pacific strategy. But here I think it's a little bit problematic because, especially in Southeast Asia, many people, politicians remember SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was kind of NATO-light because despite the name Southeast Asia, the majority were Western countries and even Pakistan involved. So it was not a regional security organization, but an organization where the majority of the members were non-regional actors. So I think also here the EU must be very careful. So cooperation definitely, but not try to dominate this cooperation because it's Indo-Pacific, they are the local actors and the EU should contribute, but it doesn't dominate. And my last remark, United Kingdom. No, I don't diminish the role of UK. On the contrary. So I'm very sorry about the Brexit, because the EU would be the EU would be much more stronger just thinking of foreign policy, nothing else. But I think a combination of France, UK power under EU flag in the Indo-Pacific would make sense. And maybe AUKUS could be a kind of start to bring, to normalize the relations and find a new platform cooperation between the three Anglo-Saxon powers and some European powers.
If you allow just a short comment on China, that is not my daily headache, but a lot of headache, because having lived in China for 10 years, I always seek for opportunities in cooperation. But wherever I go, whatever I screen through, I hardly see any opportunities, because due to the internal dynamics in China, so this country is closing massively. Had you asked me this question 10 years ago when I lived in China, I had been way more optimistic in this respect. There had been a lot of channels open and a lot of interest and different stakeholders. Now this has been really narrowed down, and that aside the ideology, which plays an awkward role in this respect. So my outlook is quite pessimistic. I must say, I would love to give you a different answer, but I don't see it. From health to climate change, these are the things normally mentioned in fields of cooperation. I don't see many options. And well, what we might see what will change in China, but my outlook is rather pessimistic. And maybe to your comment on the normative power versus hard power, I'm less pessimistic in this respect if it comes to European influence. Yes, we have to improve communication, to share efforts, but the nations around are very carefully balancing. And it's not only ASEAN who is really caught in this dilemma. It's not so different, by the way, to the European situation, where we have to balance our relation on the transatlantic relation. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. Maybe you have to be sometimes less ambitious. You mentioned that concept of like-minded countries, so we have the illusion that there are a lot of friends out there. There aren't. Be aware that you can count in one hand. Japan, I would say, is probably the closest. But they are sharing interests. And we have to carefully analyze where the potential is. This is not well done. And the problem here in Europe is it's the level of Europe and the national states level, which are often contradicting, unfortunately. So this is the first part of the homework we have to do.
Very strong words there. And I appreciate that, your frankness about these issues. Marcus, you wanted to answer one of those?
Yes, I just take a deep breath because I wanted to add on what has been mentioned before, the term like-mindedness. So that's a term, of course, which is used now for the last couple of years very prominently, times and again. And if we add the view from industry on that, because in the final end, we have to operationalize this term. So that's a key point. And the question is, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my own company? How does translate like-mindedness into a profit and loss statement? So that's a question a company is asking. And actually, companies say, okay, we appreciate that term, yes, and we have well understood, but this doesn't help me to increase my profits. So the question is, what can we do? And what we did, I would like to share with you one most recent experience, actually, in order to find out, was there any positive impact being felt in the companies as a result of this, using this term of like-mindedness. And we just recently did a business confidence survey among German businesses in Japan and asked them, well, is there any positive impact on that? And they said, yes, in our headquarters, this terminology has put Japan on the top level in among the board meetings and in the topics we are discussing. So this helped at least to put Japan very much in front of the topics when it comes to Asia, and that they said, okay, this terminology, yes, doesn't help to increase business immediately, but it paves the way first to look more deeply, more closely into Japan from a positive perspective, and in this regard, it was a very good initiative. But the operationalization, that's the topic, of course, the companies have to finally do. No? That's an additional remark on that to make it a little bit more practical. No?
If I may just pick up a point. RWE, a German company, today on the front page of the Financial Times complained about sanctions on Xinjiang. And we know about these sanctions. The EU, the UK, and the US have these sanctions. And because they said they need, for their Green Deal, they need these components, which might be made with slave labor, but in order to make the European Green Deal, we should turn a blind eye to this. And we also know that solar panels, China has a huge market. They're blocking 3 key components so that they cannot be manufactured outside of China. How do you address this? Because now Europe is, if they want their Green Deal, there's a bit of a contradiction. They are so heavily reliant on China, and this will even increase to meet their green goals. So how would you suggest we get out of this conundrum?
In short term, it's a paradox we cannot solve. We have to slowly move on to new suppliers. And the question you raised in the beginning of carefully looking at this an issue of due diligence. It's a discussion we have in Germany on the supply chain law to make sure that there are certain standards fulfilled. That causes a lot of headache, and Mr. Schirmer, I think you can way better explain this on the company level, what restrictions we are running in. I remember a discussion a couple of years ago on the Southeast Asia, on the ASEAN issue, because this has often been mentioned. That was the palm oil issue. And Europe focused very much only on this topic. And we lost a lot of opportunities, even in the transformation business, because we excluded opportunities in the energy sector. For example, Malaysia, for example, was very upset. And ASEAN, for a couple of years, had been not willing to negotiate on this level. So this is a bit of an art in politics, how to approach issues. If you focus solely on one specific issue, which makes a lot of press here in Europe, you get the right applause, but it doesn't help you to systematically and strategically achieve your goals in a broader sense.
Well, I agree with you. It's more of an art than a science. It's carefully balancing all of these various interests. Robert mentioned NATO, and also we have to keep in mind, back in Madrid in June, they had the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4, attended the first time ever. So you had South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So I think that there are also increasing overtures. I live in Brussels now for 15 years, and there are 2 elephants in the room here. So NATO and the EU, and seldom did they talk. Now we see many more levels of communication. I heard that there are about 60 dialogues going on, which is incredible. This is a massive change that we should recognize. And there are certain things that NATO can't do that the EU can do. So there's some, there's still frictions, there's still some issues, but I think that they can work more closely together. And I think that that is something that we've seen happen. And in regard to the wonderful PowerPoint at the beginning, and you picked up on the circle, the Venn diagram, and the squeezing, I thought it's really interesting to keep in mind. We call it the Indo-Pacific, but one of those circles on there was Russia, and Russia doesn't even use the language Indo-Pacific. They were kind of like Europe a few years ago. Europe never could say Indo-Pacific because it was too heavily laden with luggage. They didn't want to use that language. I know from first-hand experience, I'd organized, I think it was the first conference in Brussels on the Indo-Pacific, and one by one, everyone was canceling at the very last minute because they weren't allowed by their governments to attend. So I understood how important this word Indo-Pacific is, and we have to also see the amount of travel Europe has made from not even attending a conference with Indo-Pacific to having their own Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think we've seen a big change. But and soft power, I mean, that's Europe is supposed to be their super strength, but now they're a geopolitical player, and they need to build up those geopolitical muscles, and that's going to be a big contradiction, because it's nice to sit on the fence and not be a geopolitical player. So it's a bit of a contradiction in their approach. They want to be a geopolitical player, but they don't want to take any of the risks involved in making any choices like that. All right, let's go on for some more questions. Please raise your hands. Oh, yes, Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Pape. I was in Japan for a long time, and I was working with the Commission there in particular. I haven't heard a word which I think is central again. It's industrial policy, because as a feeling, the whole panel, more or less everybody, is much more in favor now to intervene into the market than ever before. Not only for security reasons, which in my understanding very often is a pretext to intervene, but even for the enterprise as such. They need the state more than ever. This kind of governance intervention, is it common? Particularly in Japan, I think it's coming up as well. In Southeast Asia as well. China, of course, it has its top-down system of governance. And I wonder how far this leads to protectionism, which is the second step, the consequences of this industrial policy. That's my issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tomi?
Yeah, Tomi Huhtanen from Martin Center. One generic question, just to, you know, in the beginning, well, you mentioned that there's, you know, in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, there's arms race happening. So maybe some words about the whole China's, how the region is reacting to China's assertive profile, which has changed quite dramatically in 10 last years. So because we were mentioning the lines, all that, so how that is playing. And the second part of the question then, how the European business is reacting on that, because you feel that with war in Ukraine, there was sudden realization also here in Brussels. Before that, as Peter mentioned, when we spoke about Asia, it was about China. Suddenly there's a realization that, hey, if something happens that happens related to Taiwan, there will be consequences. And so what we, you know, one has a feeling that the business is looking now other options, maybe India, some other countries. So how is that playing out?
Oh, great question. Very timely. And I'll take one more question. Okay, so we've got industrial policy and kind of the geopolitical ramifications of all of this. Who would like to take the first stab at that?
Maybe I would like to answer to Wolfgang's comment, which I also mentioned in my introduction. The biggest headache is indeed that we have a kind of green protectionism, that now we greenwash a lot of things, unfortunately, which are not green. And industrial policy is maybe the new code under which we cover this. We have different traditions in Asia, and a lot of them are state-driven. That is a fact, and Japan has always been in this. But Vietnam is still a kind of socialist planned economy with a lot of freedom, yes. In this respect, I think we should keep our borders open. This is not forgetting that there are dumping issues, that rules have to be applied, that reciprocity should work in, but that is a huge advantage of Europe. And we should not lose this weight. There are different traditions in Europe. This is an ongoing fight now between France, for example, and Germany. But the essence of Europe has been these open markets, integrating, not dividing, not fragmenting, not setting up new borders. That is a huge danger. And I see my dear colleague Jaroslav, he worked extensively on the carbon emission issue. That might be an issue which is neither conform with the WTO rules nor in our philosophy. Keep these markets open, as difficult as it is, I must say, but this is an obligation, I think, for Europe. That's the only huge area where I think this idea of a free market, enterprise-based economy is still vivid.
If I can just pick up on a point, because industrialists are complaining that Europe needs to create better incentives to invest here, and that one noted that it's a 550 million euro a year just to meet compliance regulations. So it's becoming so expensive for them to do business in Europe, they're looking to invest elsewhere. So this is, I can see why industrial policy is raising its head, and this is another big...
Well, there are a lot of promises, and each government is always pledging for de-bureaucratizing. The quite contrary is often happening. Where I see the state indeed, and a bit contrary to what you mentioned, is in helping businesses establishing. I have seen this in Southeast Asia, for example, in the field of green energy. There is a state support needed. The market conditions, if there are markets at all, and there aren't most of the time, need some political backing. Otherwise, we are outcompeted by other forces. That's the only point where I see that Europe or the nation states should support them on a political level, but not in micromanagement or tons of regulations.
And in Japan, as we know in the past, you know, they had MITI and picking winners and not kind of getting rid of the losers. So Japan has a long history of dealing with industrial policy. And back in the 80s, this was in economic history, this was kind of the big question. Maybe countries should copy Japan, but then Japan's like, no, we're not even happy with this.
Yeah, so I was just wondering how to comment on Mr. Pape's comment. Very interesting, and try to combine it with what Peter Hefele mentioned. So it came to my mind to look into the currently promoted Economic Security Act Japan is just now putting into place. I think this is a good example right now. And I think it's, first of all about a question to find the right balance between restrictions and economic freedom. So that's, I think, that's the challenge. Now, all of us who are basically part of the game have to find a good solution. It's about transparency, clear definitions of and making everything plannable, and the interest of especially the SMEs need to be kept into consideration. I think they are hardest hit, so to speak, because they have, just because of their size, they have much more difficulties they are facing, whereas the huge companies, the big ones, of course, they have big departments who are managing everything. So I think the interest of the smaller companies needs to be kept, needs to be taken into consideration. And I think one topic which is currently also being raised in Japan when it comes to this economic security law is that the interest of the government and the interest of the companies are not necessarily the interest of the stakeholders, especially when taking into consideration if a Japanese company, let's take a huge Japanese company, is not having only Japanese stakeholders, in case there is a US stakeholder. And this US stakeholder has a different opinion, which is not in line with the economic security law. What happens? So there are big issues that need to be discussed, and I think there are no answers and best practices yet, and there is still a lot of learning, in my opinion, and that's actually a very interesting topic which needs to be taken into consideration. And there is another discussion going on in Japan right now. If while on the one hand side the huge stock listed companies, whether Mitsubishi, Fujitsu, and you name them, they all have their departments focusing in the implementation, realization of economic security. But now looking from a third party perspective on their activities, on the law, the question is, how can we make sure that this does not turn out or develop into a new modern protectionism? How can we make this sure? This is, I think, a very interesting question right now. It's very hard to answer, and I have not seen an answer yet in Japan, and I think that's really going to see how this will develop, and probably a topic for another debate here. And this is really very interesting, and this, of course, affects our foreign business with Japan and with the Japanese partners as well, naturally.
Excellent. This gentleman caught my eye, and this will be the last question, I'm sorry, and then everyone will make their final remarks.
Jarosław Pietras, I'm linked with Martin Center, I'm research associate here. I didn't want to speak because I'm not specialist in Indo-Pacific, but during the first PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Fasserman, I became a bit depressed because it looks like in the future we are having a very difficult situation in vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific region. And I was thinking maybe the title is wrong. It should be how Indo-Pacific will splash over Europe. Because Dr. Fassabend was saying in human terms, everyone will develop much more quickly. There will be much more people. When I look at Ukrainian and Russian war, I don't think that the number of people makes a change. And maybe the big number of people will be a problem, not a solution. We are going to a different type of economy, and this might a bit change. If you look at the energy that you have shown, in the energy sector, if you use too much energy, maybe you use it not sufficiently well. Maybe it's not very efficient. Maybe you are concentrated on producing material goods which require plenty of energy, whereas American or European economy becomes much more service. And when you look at domination, I would check what kind of operation system computers have in Japan or China or Africa. Do they use own developed or they use Windows? And then when you see how this is, what kind of splash we have made on these countries, then I'm old enough to remember, but still remember my student time when I was told Japan is developing so quickly that will overtake US. And we should follow this type of model of development because otherwise we will be lost. And well, Japan has not taken over US. Now, indirectly, we are saying we should take industrial policy, which is more like in China, to develop much more by deciding that we should develop, for example, net zero industry, and then to push all the resources to do that. Are we sure that it will be successful in the future? I think if we believe in liberal democracy, we should be serious that this development and also development technology helps to maintain this system. And it's not necessarily that Indo-Pacific will dominate or splash over Europe too strongly.
Well, I'm glad that you pretty much kind of helped draw towards a conclusion, but it might be more of a tsunami than a splash, what happens in this region. So, but the debate about the economic debate about picking winners, and we know that everyone sees China as 10 feet tall, but we know we can follow their investments in certain areas, and it's not producing as everyone had hoped. So they're missing the kind of magic ingredients. And where will the next disruptive technology grow? I don't think it's going to be coming from China. There's you need that special ability to create the future, and I don't know if that's certainly coming from there or not. We'll wait to see. But I will have. I'll start in this direction, and for your final remarks. And I think it's lovely how you talked about how the Indo-Pacific is splashing on us. It's clear that the Indo-Pacific is important for all of us. So let's
start. So that's a challenge. So my takeaway, or what did I learn from that? Basically, two remarks. Looking at all the potentials in Asia Pacific, I think we have talked about this as well. I would say first, explore the unexploited potential and increase sense of urgency. These are my two remarks.
Excellent. Alfred?
If I could use part of my time for the... If I could use some part of my conclusion to answer Tommy's really important question about the arms race. Well, if we put ourselves in the shoes of, let's say, a Chinese general, and if you look around your borders, you see many US military bases, and you see the US 7th Fleet. So I do understand reasons why the Chinese have to invest in their army to upgrade their defense capabilities. But of course, this sparks an arms race, because then Vietnam, Japan, other countries have to respond. AUKUS is a direct response to China's assertiveness, because the Australians, they're acquiring in the next 10 or 15 years, so it takes a long time, nuclear submarines. And then, of course, they're much more capable to conduct freedom of navigation operations, to patrol in the South China Sea, because nuclear submarines are impossible to detect. So this is the next challenge for China, and I'm sure that China will also somehow respond. To give you just a small example from 2 Southeast Asian nations concerning the South China Sea, where China's assertiveness is especially visible, also in relations to Taiwan. Let's look at Malaysia. Well, Chinese vessels, the patrol within Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. What does Malaysia do? They're just monitoring the Chinese vessels. They're not stepping in. The Vietnamese are doing so. So there are 2 different ways of dealing with China's assertiveness. And I think the most interesting example right now are the Philippines, because even under former President Duterte, so during the first half of his term, he actually sought very close relations with China, but also Russia, in order to reduce the tension in the South China Sea. So he even offered kind of exchange sovereignty for more Chinese investments, but it never played out. And in fact, he didn't gain anything from China. So he switched again to closer relations with the United States. And we see it's even more extreme under new President Marcos, because their security partnership with the US is extremely strong again. And just to mention, the United States can access even more Philippine military bases. And the Philippines are very close, or they are located in the South China Sea, and geographically very closely located to Taiwan. So this is also another step, potential step in the escalation. And my conclusion is, how does the EU come in now? So I think it's really, really difficult, especially in the situation in the South China Sea. And I would say, again, the major contribution the EU can make is really as a normative power. So probably also contribute to the China-ASEAN Code of Conduct, emphasizing trust-building measures, but also don't forget the environmental issue in the South China Sea. So in the area of non-traditional security, I think the EU has a strong voice, but again, also important is to always emphasize United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and yes, also step up its hard power capabilities to, in fact, really enforce maritime security.
All right, thank you.
Maybe 3 final points, and I start with some math. 27 plus 1 is not 28, it's much more. So we have much more potential at hand if we look on the different levels of the European Union. This is unexploited, starting from the local level. Urban partnerships, for example, in a region where urbanization is the key development. Europe has to offer a lot of ideas in designing new cities, and so this is something which there's much more potential out there than we currently acknowledge and put it on the ground. The second is, sometimes we have to be more humble in our approach to Asia. We have to learn, we have to be open, we have to put things, we have to deliver. This is not only true for Asia, that goes for other regions in Africa as well. But we are attractive. I have never lost confidence in that the European model is attractive, and all the polls in the region clearly show that Europe is one of the partners to have. Yeah, and maybe a last comment on the China issue, but not only on that. Be careful with terminology. Other forces are trying to catch our basic concepts of democracy, of peace, of rules. This is probably the most dangerous issue. This is a topic for another discussion, but I would like to put this on the ground, because there is Europe where we have to hold up. And this is the core of our normative approach, and we should never let others occupy and steal these things from us. We have to find it, and we have to maintain it.
That's an excellent point. We know some countries say that their democracies are better because they understand what the people want without the people ever telling them. So let's keep in mind, and our values are important. They're not some jewelry that we put on sometimes and take off at others. So really, the power in Europe is our values. So to quote Rory Medcalf, who wrote a book on the Indo-Pacific, the overall Indo-Pacific situation is somewhere at the competition point on the spectrum, with confrontation and conflict a rising danger and constant risk. It is neither peace nor war, but continuous and comprehensive competition, covering many aspects of national power. So this afternoon, we learned a great deal from this discussion and these excellent speakers. I want to thank again the Martin Center. Europe remains a strategic region in the world, and attention focused on Ukraine is, of course, important, but over the longer term, it is a rising region, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe will be even more intertwined with it. So thank you again. Let's join hands to thank this excellent panel. Thank you so much. And thank you for being such a great audience with excellent questions. Thank you.